420 seconds. That is exactly 7 minutes. It is the exact amount of time it takes to boil a pot of water or to smoke a single, nervous cigarette. On the humid, blood-soaked soil of a nameless Pacific island, it was the exact amount of time one American aviator had left to live before a steel blade severed his head from his shoulders. Surrounded by 54 heavily armed enemy soldiers, bound, battered, and kneeling in the mud, he was utterly alone. But what happened in the next 7 minutes remains one of the most terrifying, impossible, and fiercely guarded secrets of the Second World War. This is the story of a dead man who refused to die. The air over Rabaul in late 1943 was a meat grinder. It was a suffocating, hostile expanse of sky where young men in aluminum cans played a deadly game of mathematics against flak and Zero fighters. Captain Henry Donovan of the 345th Bombardment Group, the legendary Air Apaches, knew the odds better than most. He was 24 years old, a former mechanic from the dusty plains of West Texas, and the pilot of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, affectionately christened the Devil's Errand. On the morning of November 2nd, the mission briefing had been brutally short. Intelligence had spotted a heavy concentration of Japanese supply barges hiding under the dense jungle canopy along the coast of New Britain. The strategy was simple, suicidal, and standard for the Apaches. Fly in at treetop level, drop fragmentation bombs, strafe everything that moved with the plane's devastating array of forward firing, 50 caliber machine guns, and get out before the enemy knew what hit them. Inside the cockpit, the noise was a physical entity. The twin Wright R-2600 Cyclone engines roared with a deafening, rhythmic mechanical heartbeat, vibrating through the soles of Henry's boots. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel, sweat, and hot oil filled the cramped space. Beside him, his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Thomas Decker, nervously adjusted his goggles, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. In the back, Radioman Private First Class Samuel Hayes was huddled over his equipment, while the gunners checked their feeds. "Target coming up, Artie," Decker shouted over the engine roar, pointing through the plexiglass windscreen. Henry nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. Arming the payload. "Give me a little more manifold pressure, Tommy. Let's come in fast and low." They crested a ridgeline, the emerald green canopy of the jungle suddenly dropping away to reveal a hidden cove. And there they were, a dozen camouflaged barges moored against the banks. But the Japanese were not asleep. The moment the Devil's Errand broke over the ridge, the jungle erupted. Tracers glowing red and green orbs of sudden death floated up from the tree line with deceptive laziness, before whipping past the cockpit glass at terrifying speeds. Flak. Heavy flak. 2 o'clock, Decker screamed. Henry threw the heavy bomber into a violent bank, the G-force pressing him back into his seat. He squeezed the trigger on his control wheel. The nose of the B-25 lit up as 8 heavy machine guns unleashed a torrent of lead into the tree line. Below them, palm trees splintered, and hidden anti-aircraft nests were torn apart in geysers of mud and smoke. "Bombs away," Henry yelled, pulling the release. The aircraft lurched upward as the heavy ordnance left the bay. Seconds later, a rolling thunderclap shook the sky as the fragmentation bombs detonated perfectly among the barges, sending planks, water, and fire hundreds of feet into the air. But the victory was agonizingly short-lived. As Henry banked hard to the left to slip back over the protective ridge, a 75mm anti-aircraft shell found its mark. The explosion did not just hit the plane, it seemed to consume it. A deafening crack shattered the world, followed instantly by the screech of tearing metal. The right wing dropped violently. Henry was thrown against his harness, his head smashing into the side window. "Right engine is gone," Decker yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Fire! We've got a fire!" Henry fought the controls, his muscles burning as he tried to correct the spin. He looked out the right window. The Cyclone engine was a twisted mass of flaming wreckage, a thick trail of black smoke billowing behind them. The flames were already licking at the aluminum skin of the wing, threatening to breach the fuel tanks. "Feather the prop. Cut the fuel line," Henry commanded, his hands moving with practiced, desperate speed. But the controls were completely dead. The hydraulic lines had been severed. The plane was a dying, flaming brick plummeting toward the dense, unforgiving jungle. "We're losing altitude too fast. Brace for impact." Henry screamed into the intercom, praying his crew could hear him over the chaos. There was no time to bail out. They were less than 300 feet above the canopy. The green ocean of trees rushed up to meet them. Henry cut the remaining engine, desperately trying to bleed off speed, pulling back on the yoke with every ounce of strength he possessed. The belly of the B-25 clipped the first massive mahogany tree. The sound was like the end of the world, a horrific grinding, tearing noise as the jungle violently arrested tons of moving metal. The wings sheared off. The fuselage broke apart like a cheap tin toy. Henry's world dissolved into a whirlwind of shattering glass, crushing metal, and a blinding flash of pain before everything went entirely, completely dark. Consciousness returned not as a gradual awakening, but as a violent assault of sensory agony. The first thing Henry registered was the heat, a suffocating wet blanket that smelled of burning rubber and scorched earth. The second was the pain. His left shoulder screamed with a hot, stabbing sensation, and something warm and sticky was running down the side of his face. He opened his eyes. The world was sideways. The cockpit of the Devil's Errand was an unrecognizable cage of mangled aluminum. Sunlight filtered through the dense jungle canopy above, illuminating the dust and smoke that hung thick in the air. "Decker," Henry croaked, his throat raw and coated in ash. He turned his head, wincing. The co-pilot's seat was empty, the harness violently ripped from its moorings. The entire right side of the cockpit was simply gone, sheared away by the impact. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his concussion. Henry unbuckled his harness and fell, hitting what was left of the bulkhead. He scrambled out through the gaping hole in the fuselage, tumbling into the thick undergrowth. The jungle was unnervingly silent. The insects and birds had been shocked into quiet by the violent intrusion. Henry stood on shaky legs, his right hand instinctively dropping to the M1911 pistol holstered at his hip. It was still there. "Tommy, Sammy," he rasped, scanning the wreckage. The tail section was 50 yards away, smoldering. Henry stumbled toward it, pushing through the razor-sharp kunai grass. He found the remains of the radio compartment. It was utterly crushed. There was no sign of Private Hayes or the gunners. He searched for an hour, pushing his broken body through the dense flora, finding only scattered debris, a torn parachute pack, and the grim realization that he was the sole survivor. Survival instinct, honed by years of training, took over. He couldn't stay by the wreck. The smoke column was a beacon for every Japanese patrol within 20 miles. He salvaged what he could: his sidearm, 2 spare magazines, a pilot's survival knife, a compass, and a half-empty canteen. He turned his back on the burning remains of his crew and began to walk inland, hoping to reach the rugged mountains of the interior where he might evade capture. For 2 days, Henry Donovan became a ghost in a green hell. The jungle was a relentless enemy. Leeches dropped from the trees, finding their way into his flight suit. The heat rash on his skin felt like 1,000 tiny needles. He rationed his water to a single sip an hour, his tongue swelling until it felt like a dry sponge in his mouth. His shoulder throbbed with a low, persistent rhythm of infection. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, his luck ran out. He was descending a muddy ravine, exhausted and dehydrated, when the wind shifted. He smelled it before he saw it, the faint, acrid scent of cheap tobacco and unwashed bodies. Henry froze, dropping to his stomach behind the rotting trunk of a fallen banyan tree. He drew his .45, his hands shaking slightly from fatigue. Below him, moving silently up the ravine, was a Japanese patrol. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs. He counted them as they moved in a loose, disciplined file. 10, 20, 30. They just kept coming. It was a heavily armed reinforced platoon. He counted 54 men in total, armed with Arisaka rifles, Nambu submachine guns, and a devastating Type 99 light machine gun carried by a burly soldier near the rear. Leading them was an officer with a severe, angular face, carrying a holstered Nambu pistol and a long, traditional Shingunto sword at his side. Henry held his breath, pressing his face into the damp earth, praying his olive-drab flight suit blended into the foliage. They were passing within 20 yards of him. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the ravine. A branch, rotting and unstable, had given way beneath Henry's boot. As he instinctively shifted his weight, the entire platoon stopped. 54 pairs of eyes snapped toward the ridge. The officer barked a sharp command in Japanese. Instantly, a dozen rifles were raised, pointing directly at the fallen banyan tree. "Come out, American!" the officer shouted in heavily accented broken English. "You are surrounded! Put weapon down!" Henry weighed his options. He had 21 rounds of ammunition. There were 54 of them. If he fired, he might take 2 or 3 down before they turned the ridge into Swiss cheese. Dying in a firefight was preferable to a POW camp, but a small, stubborn voice in his head whispered a different strategy. Survive. Buy time. Slowly, deliberately, Henry pushed himself up from behind the log. He tossed his M1911 over the log, where it landed in the mud with a dull thud. He raised his hands, keeping them open and visible. A squad of soldiers rushed up the embankment, their bayonets fixed and gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Before Henry could speak, the butt of a rifle crashed into the back of his knees, sending him crashing to the ground. Rough hands grabbed his hair, hauling him up, while others expertly patted him down. They found his survival knife, his compass, and stripped him of his flight jacket, leaving him in his torn, sweat-soaked undershirt. They marched him down to the officer. The man looked at Henry with an expression of profound disgust. He did not ask for name, rank, or serial number. He simply spat at Henry's feet, turned, and signaled the platoon to move out. With his hands bound tightly behind his back with harsh, biting rope, Henry was shoved forward. Every time he stumbled, a bayonet point prodded him viciously in the ribs. He was a prisoner of the Imperial Japanese Army. But as they marched deeper into the claustrophobic jungle, Henry noticed they weren't heading toward any established roads or coastlines. They were heading deeper into nowhere. A sickening realization began to settle in his gut. They were not taking him to a camp. The march lasted for hours, dragging on until the oppressive heat of the day began to break, replaced by the long, sinister shadows of the late afternoon. They finally stopped in a wide, natural clearing, surrounded by towering bamboo shoots. The canopy above was thick enough to block out the sky, turning the clearing into a dim, green-lit amphitheater. The platoon fanned out, soldiers dropping their heavy packs and immediately setting up a defensive perimeter. The burly soldier carrying the Type 99 machine gun propped the heavy weapon against the base of a massive tree on the edge of the clearing, directly facing the center, before joining his comrades to open their ration tins. Henry was forcefully shoved into the center of the clearing and forced to his knees in the soft, loamy dirt. His legs were numb, his shoulders screaming in agony. 2 guards stood directly behind him, their rifles resting casually on their shoulders, chatting quietly in Japanese. The officer stepped forward. He had removed his tunic, revealing a crisp, white shirt. He slowly, methodically unbuckled his scabbard and held it in his left hand. The reality of the situation crashed over Henry like a wave of ice water. There would be no interrogation. There would be no prison camp. The Geneva Convention did not exist in this shadowed clearing. This was an execution. "You bomb our ships," the officer stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He drew the sword from its scabbard. The steel hissed, catching the faint light. It was a beautiful, terrifying weapon, the edge polished to a mirror finish. "You burn our men. Now, you pay." Henry stared up at the man. Fear, primal and suffocating, threatened to paralyze him. He could feel the cold sweat tracing lines through the grime on his face. He was 24. He was going to die in a place his family couldn't even find on a map. His body would be left for the scavengers. But beneath the terror, something else ignited. It was a cold, hard ember of absolute, unadulterated rage. He thought of Tommy Decker plunging into the trees. He thought of Sammy Hayes crushed in the back of the plane. He refused to go out on his knees, offering his neck like a sacrificial lamb. The officer stepped to Henry's left, taking a wide stance. He raised the katana high above his head, gripping the hilt with both hands. The soldiers around the perimeter stopped eating, turning their attention to the center of the clearing to watch the spectacle. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the jungle. Henry's mind raced. 7 minutes. That was how long the sun would still filter through the canopy before dusk plunged them into total darkness. He didn't know why that number popped into his head, but it felt prophetic. He flexed his wrists. The rope binding his hands behind his back was incredibly tight, cutting off the circulation. But earlier, when he had been shoved to the ground, his fingers had brushed against something hard and sharp protruding from the seam of his heavy canvas trousers. It was a jagged shard of aluminum, no bigger than a thumbnail, blown into his leg during the crash, which the soldiers had missed during their pat-down. As the officer had been speaking, Henry's slick, bloody fingers had been desperately working the shard against the thick hemp rope. It was agonizingly slow work, slicing his own skin as much as the rope. The officer adjusted his grip, his eyes locked on the back of Henry's neck. He took a deep, centering breath. Snap. The sound was microscopic, loud only in Henry's mind. One of the main braids of the rope gave way. The tension released just enough. "For the Emperor," the officer shouted, his voice echoing in the clearing. The sword began its deadly arc downward. The blade cut through the air with a terrifying, whistling sound. Henry didn't think. He reacted. With a violent, explosive surge of adrenaline, he violently wrenched his arms apart. The weakened rope snapped completely. In the exact same fraction of a second, he threw his body forward and rolled violently to the right. The katana struck the earth where Henry's neck had been a millisecond before, burying itself 3 inches into the mud with a dull thwack. The momentum pulled the officer slightly off balance. Henry didn't hesitate. He sprang from his knees like a coiled spring. He didn't run away. He lunged directly at the officer. Before the startled Japanese commander could rip his blade from the earth, Henry drove his right fist, propelled by pure, desperate survival instinct, directly into the man's throat. The officer's eyes widened in shock, a horrific gurgling sound escaping his crushed windpipe as he collapsed backward. The clearing erupted. 54 soldiers, momentarily stunned by the impossible reversal, began screaming. Rifles were swung. Bolts clattered as rounds were chambered. Henry didn't look back. His eyes were locked on a singular target, 30 feet away. The massive tree, the Type 99 light machine gun resting against it, the heavy canvas bag of spare 30-round magazines lying open beside it. He had 420 seconds to change history, and the clock had just started ticking. The 30 feet between Henry Donovan and the heavy, black steel of the Type 99 machine gun stretched out like a mile of broken glass. It was a terrifying expanse of churned, muddy earth, slick with rotting vegetation and the oppressive humidity of the jungle. The very millisecond the Japanese officer's body hit the dirt, his windpipe crushed and his sword buried in the soil, the stunned silence of the clearing shattered into absolute pandemonium. "Get him! Shoot the American!" A voice shrieked in Japanese, raw with panic and fury. 54 men, highly trained and deeply disciplined, momentarily lost their minds. They scrambled frantically for their stacked Arisaka rifles. Bolts clattered, safety catches clicked, and the air was instantly filled with the deafening, sharp cracks of high-velocity gunfire. Henry did not run in a straight line. He moved with a desperate, animalistic ferocity, his mind flashing back to the dusty training grounds of West Texas. He heard the gravelly voice of his old drill instructor, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Bulldog Gallagher, screaming in his ear. "Make yourself a ghost, Donovan. You never give a man a straight line to shoot at. Make him shoot where you were, not where you are." He dropped his right shoulder, digging his boots into the slick mud, and launched himself into a violent, erratic zigzag pattern. Bullets snapped past his ears like angry hornets. The air around him was physically displaced by the passing rounds. A bullet grazed the heavy fabric of his trousers, missing flesh by a fraction of an inch. Another slammed into a bamboo shoot to his left, showering his face with razor-sharp green splinters. 10 feet, 5 feet. He lunged for the base of the massive mahogany tree. But he was not the only one moving. The burly Japanese gunner, realizing his catastrophic error in leaving the squad's primary support weapon unattended, had drawn his Nambu pistol and sprinted from the perimeter. They converged on the Type 99 at the exact same moment. The gunner was heavier, fueled by the shame of his mistake. He barreled into Henry just as the American's fingers brushed the cold steel of the bipod. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. Both men tumbled backward into the thick, thorny underbrush, a mess of flailing limbs and desperate grunts. Henry's left shoulder, already severely injured from the plane crash, screamed in absolute agony as the heavy gunner pinned him down. The Japanese soldier raised his Nambu pistol, pointing it directly between Henry's eyes, a snarl of pure hatred twisting his face. There was no time to think. Henry didn't reach for the gun. Instead, he drove his right thumb directly into the man's left eye socket with every ounce of terrifying, adrenaline-fueled strength he possessed. The gunner shrieked, a horrific, bubbling sound of agony, his finger convulsing on the trigger. The Nambu fired, the muzzle flash singing Henry's eyebrow as the bullet buried itself harmlessly in the dirt an inch from his ear. Henry bucked his hips violently, throwing the blinded, thrashing man off him. He grabbed a jagged, heavy stone from the mud and brought it down in a brutal, sickening arc against the gunner's temple. The man went limp. Henry scrambled forward, his chest heaving, his vision spotting with black from the pain in his shoulder. He reached the Type 99. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of machinery, weighing over 20 pounds, chambered in the devastating 7.7 millimeters caliber. Beside it lay the heavy canvas satchel, unbuckled, revealing rows of curved 30-round magazines. He grabbed the weapon by its top carrying handle, swung it around the thick trunk of the mahogany tree, and jammed the bipod into the soft earth. He slammed a magazine into the top feed, racked the heavy bolt back with a sharp metallic clack, and pressed the stock firmly into his uninjured right shoulder. When he looked down the iron sights, the scene in the clearing was a chaotic nightmare. The Japanese platoon had not yet scattered into the jungle. They were still grouped near their packs, desperately trying to form a firing line to shoot at the tree. They expected a terrified, unarmed man to be cowering behind the wood. They expected to pin him down and bayonet him. They did not expect the devil's errand boy to be looking back at them over the barrel of their own machine gun. Henry squeezed the trigger. The Type 99 roared to life. It was not a mechanical chug. It was a continuous, deafening wall of sound. A mechanical beast unleashing pure hellfire. A brilliant, blinding tongue of flame erupted from the flash hider. The heavy weapon bucked violently against Henry's shoulder, but he held it down, sweeping the muzzle in a wide, lethal arc across the clustered soldiers. The 7.7 millimeters rounds were designed to pierce light armor. Against human flesh, they were apocalyptic. The initial burst was devastating. The front rank of the Japanese firing line simply ceased to exist, cut down like wheat before a scythe. Men were thrown backward, their screams completely drowned out by the relentless, thundering roar of the machine gun. Wood splintered, packs exploded, and the air instantly filled with a thick, choking fog of white cordite smoke and a fine red mist. Henry held the trigger down for a solid 5 seconds, sweeping left, then right, then center. The gun clicked empty. The sudden silence that followed was heavy, ringing, and absolute, broken only by the groans of the dying and the frantic rustling of the survivors, diving for the safety of the deep jungle. Henry dropped the empty magazine. The barrel of the Type 99 was already smoking, radiating a searing heat. His hands were slick with sweat, and his own blood from his wrists, but his mind was crystal clear. It was a terrifying, hyper-focused clarity. He glanced up through the canopy. The sun was rapidly sinking. The dappled emerald light of the clearing was turning into a deep, bruised purple. The shadows were lengthening, stretching across the muddy ground like grasping fingers. 6 minutes left. The first minute had been a massacre, but the remaining soldiers, he estimated there were still at least 30 of them, out there, were not going to stand in the open again. They were veterans. They were highly trained predators of the Pacific Theater. The initial shock had worn off, and now the hunt was on. And Henry Donovan, heavily outnumbered, bleeding, and trapped hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, was exactly where he wanted to be. The return fire began not as a volley, but as a coordinated, terrifying suppression tactic. From the deep brush, on the opposite side of the clearing, a half-dozen Arasaka rifles cracked in unison. The heavy bark of the mahogany tree behind Henry exploded, showering him with fist-sized chunks of jagged wood and pulped sap. They were trying to pin him down. They were flanking him. Henry knew he couldn't stay static. The mahogany tree was a fortress, but it was also a tomb if they surrounded him. He snatched up the heavy canvas satchel containing the remaining 6 magazines, slung it across his chest, and grabbed the red-hot carrying handle of the Type 99. He waited for the next volley of suppressing fire. Crack, crack, crack. The bullets slammed into the wood. The instant the firing paused, Henry threw himself flat onto his stomach and low-crawled backward into the dense, suffocating embrace of the bamboo thicket behind the tree. The razor-sharp leaves sliced at his face and arms, but he pushed deeper into the shadows, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid making a sound. He had retreated 30 yards into the jungle when he heard the guttural shouts in Japanese. They were moving in. He could hear the heavy thud of boots running across the muddy clearing, the frantic rustle of brush as the platoon fanned out to envelop his former position. Henry stopped, wedging himself beneath the thick, rotting roots of a fallen banyan tree. The darkness here was almost absolute. The humidity was a physical weight on his chest. He loaded a fresh magazine into the top of the Type 99, ensuring the bolt was locked back, ready to fire. He needed to thin their numbers. He needed to use their discipline against them. He heard a twig snap. It was close. No more than 20 feet to his left. He held his breath, closing his eyes to focus entirely on his hearing. The soft, rhythmic squelch of boots in the mud. The faint, metallic clink of a rifle sling hitting a belt buckle. There were 2 of them, moving in a practiced leapfrog pattern, clearing the brush. Henry gently placed the heavy machine gun in the mud. He reached down to his right boot. The guards had taken his survival knife, but they hadn't checked the hidden sheath sewn into the lining of his heavy flight boots. He pulled out a slender, double-edged boot knife, a gift from his older brother, Staff Sergeant William Donovan, before he shipped out. He waited. The first soldier stepped past his hiding spot, his eyes scanning the trees ahead, his rifle raised to his shoulder. The second soldier followed 10 feet behind, checking the flanks. As the second soldier drew level with the banyan roots, Henry exploded from the darkness. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the soldier's rifle barrel with his left hand, forcefully jerking it downward, while simultaneously driving the boot knife upward into the soft gap just below the man's steel helmet, severing the brainstem. The soldier went limp instantly, dead before he hit the ground. Henry lowered the body silently into the mud. The first soldier, hearing the faint rustle, spun around, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Henry had already scooped up the fallen soldier's Arasaka rifle. He didn't bother bringing it to his shoulder. He fired from the hip. The loud crack echoed through the jungle, and the 6.5 millimeters round caught the lead soldier squarely in the chest, throwing him backward into the ferns. The jungle erupted again. The gunshot had given away his position. Shouts echoed through the trees, and a hail of blind fire shredded the canopy above Henry's head. 5 minutes. Henry dropped the rifle, grabbed his machine gun, and sprinted deeper into the jungle, running parallel to the clearing. He was a phantom, a ghost woven from mud, blood, and cordite. He knew he was bleeding heavily from his shoulder and his slashed wrists, leaving a trail for them to follow. But he also knew that fear was a virus, and he had just infected the entire platoon. They were no longer fighting a scared, bound pilot. They were fighting a demon in the dark. He scrambled up a steep, muddy embankment, ignoring the burning agony in his muscles. At the top, he found a shallow depression behind a thick cluster of boulders. It offered a commanding view of the lower jungle floor, which was now completely draped in the deep, inky shadows of twilight. He set up the Type 99 on the rocks. Below him, he could see the beams of 2 flashlights cutting through the gloom as the Japanese soldiers desperately searched for him. They were angry, confused, and terrified. They were clustering together, seeking safety in numbers. It was a fatal tactical error. Henry took aim at the center of the largest group, illuminated faintly by the bouncing flashlight beams. He waited until he could see the silhouette of a man waving his arm. likely the senior non-commissioned officer, trying to rally the squad. Henry pulled the trigger. The heavy machine gun spat a 3-second burst of fire down into the ravine. The 7.7mm tracers, glowing a demonic red, slashed through the darkness like laser beams. The impact was horrific. The flashlight beams spun wildly into the air and crashed into the mud as the men holding them were torn apart. Screams echoed up the embankment, followed by the frantic, disorganized popping of return fire that flew harmlessly over Henry's head. He didn't wait to admire his work. He grabbed the hot gun and rolled sideways, scrambling 10 yards to the left to a new position behind a rotting log. A split second later, a shower of fragmentation grenades detonated right where he had just been, throwing dirt and jagged rocks over his head. 4 minutes. The remaining Japanese soldiers realized that shooting blindly into the dark was suicide. Silence fell over the jungle again, heavier and more terrifying than before. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, but the roles had completely reversed. Henry was hunting them. He needed to keep the pressure on. He crept down the embankment, his boots making barely a whisper against the wet leaves. He found the bodies of the men he had just ambushed. He quickly rifled through their webbing, his hands stained with their blood. He found 4 Type 97 fragmentation grenades. He pulled the pins on 2 of them, held the heavy brass cylinders in his hands, and lobbed them as far as he could into the thickest part of the brush where he suspected the remaining men were hiding. Boom, boom. The explosions rocked the jungle floor, sending a shower of shrapnel and dirt into the canopy. The blast was immediately followed by shrieks of pain and the panicked, chaotic firing of a dozen rifles shooting at shadows. The Japanese discipline was completely breaking down. They were shooting at each other in the dark. Henry seized the chaos. He moved rapidly along their flank, setting up the Type 99 every 20 yards, firing short, controlled bursts into the muzzle flashes of the enemy rifles, and immediately moving again. He was everywhere and nowhere. He was a one-man army, utilizing the thick vegetation, the encroaching darkness, and the sheer raw power of his captured weapon to systematically dismantle a heavily armed force. His body was failing him. The blood loss was making him dizzy. His vision swam with gray spots, and the heavy machine gun felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But a cold, unyielding fire burned in his chest. He saw the faces of Tommy Decker and Sammy Hayes every time he closed his eyes. He would not stop until the jungle was entirely, completely quiet. He rounded a massive banyan tree and nearly collided with 3 Japanese soldiers who were retreating, their faces pale masks of terror. They were so shocked to see him, covered in mud and blood, holding the massive gun at his hip, that they froze for a fraction of a second. It was a fraction of a second too long. Henry held the trigger down, sweeping the barrel across them at point-blank range. The concussive force of the muzzle blast nearly knocked him backward. The 3 men fell like broken marionettes. The bolt of the Type 99 locked back with a hollow clank. The weapon was empty. He reached into his satchel. It was empty, too. He had fired over 200 rounds of heavy ammunition in less than 6 minutes. Henry dropped the useless machine gun. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. The frantic popping of Arasaka rifles had ceased. The shouting had stopped. There were only the sounds of the jungle, the wind rustling the canopy, the distant call of a night bird, and the low, wet groans of the dying scattered across the blood-soaked earth. He leaned against the banyan tree, sliding down the trunk until he was sitting in the mud. He unholstered the captured Nambu pistol he had taken from the gunner earlier, resting it on his knee. His breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. He looked at the sky. The last sliver of purple light faded, and the jungle was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Exactly 7 minutes had passed since the blade of the katana had swung toward his neck. He waited in the dark, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of the Nambu. He waited for a final rush, a banzai charge, a stray bullet. He sat there for an hour, listening to the agonizingly slow cessation of life around him. But no one came. Out of 54 heavily armed, combat-hardened soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, not a single man was left standing to challenge him. The dead man had refused to die, and in doing so, He had dragged them all into hell with him. When the first thin, gray light of dawn finally pierced the dense jungle canopy, it revealed a scene of unimaginable carnage. The clearing, which just 12 hours prior had been a pristine, hidden amphitheater of emerald green, was now a scorched, cratered graveyard. The smell of copper, voided bowels, and burnt cordite hung in the humid air, thick and suffocating. The buzzing of corpse flies had already begun, a low, maddening hum that replaced the frantic roar of gunfire. Henry Donovan sat at the base of the massive banyan tree, his eyes open but unblinking. He was alive, but he looked like a corpse that had been violently dragged behind a truck. His olive-drab undershirt was black, with dried blood. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder grossly swollen and radiating a deep, pulsing heat of severe infection. His hands were lacerated and raw, his fingernails caked with dark mud and human tissue. He slowly pushed himself to his feet. The world spun sickeningly, his vision swimming with gray static from extreme blood loss and dehydration. He leaned heavily against the rough bark, forcing himself to breathe through his nose, fighting down the wave of nausea that threatened to drop him back into the dirt. He had to move. The sheer volume of gunfire from the previous evening would undoubtedly draw the attention of larger Japanese patrols in the sector. He could not be found here, surrounded by the horrific handiwork of his desperate survival. Moving with the agonizing stiffness of an old man, Henry began to scavenge. He stepped over the bodies of the men he had killed, forcing his mind to detach from the brutal reality of the slaughter. He was no longer a pilot. He was an animal driven solely by the primitive need to survive. He found the Japanese officer he had crushed the day before. The man's eyes were wide and glassy, staring up at the canopy. Henry reached into the officer's tunic and pulled out a leather map case, a brass compass, and a small silver tin of water purification tablets. From another fallen soldier, he salvaged 2 full canteens and a heavily soiled field dressing. He wrapped the dressing tightly around his shattered shoulder, biting down on his lip so hard it bled to keep from screaming as he pulled the canvas tight. He secured the canteens to his belt, checked the compass against the topographical map, and set a heading due south toward the jagged, volcanic spine of the island. Allied intelligence had suggested Australian coast watchers might be operating in the deep highlands. It was a needle in a haystack, but it was his only hope. He turned his back on the clearing and walked into the green abyss. The next 4 days were a blur of hallucinatory agony. The jungle was a relentless, merciless adversary that sought to finish the job the Japanese platoon had started. The terrain was a nightmare of steep, muddy ravines, razor-sharp kunai grass that sliced through his trousers, and hidden, stagnant swamps teeming with leeches and malarial mosquitoes. By the second day, the infection in his shoulder had spread, bringing on a raging fever. Henry stumbled through the undergrowth, his mind fracturing under the strain. He began to have waking dreams. He saw First Lieutenant Tommy Decker walking beside him, casually smoking a cigarette and pointing out enemy positions that weren't there. He heard Private Sammy Hayes tapping out frantic Morse code on the trunk of a rotting palm tree. Henry would converse with them, mumbling quietly through cracked, bleeding lips, drawing a strange, desperate comfort from their phantom presence. He survived on rainwater, caught in broad leaves and a handful of bitter, unfamiliar roots he dug from the mud. His boots rotted on his feet, exposing his blistered flesh to the unforgiving jungle floor. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, every breath a ragged, wheezing struggle against his own failing body. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the terrain began to change. The dense, suffocating lowlands gave way to steeper, rocky inclines. The air grew marginally cooler. Henry was climbing a treacherous, scree-covered slope when his left leg simply gave out. The muscle tore with a sickening pop, and he collapsed, tumbling backward down the embankment and slamming hard into the muddy bank of a fast-moving, narrow river. He lay there on his back, staring up at the sliver of blue sky visible through the trees. The pain was gone, replaced by a deep, numbing cold that terrified him more than the fever. He knew what this was. His body was shutting down. The adrenaline had finally burned out, leaving nothing but an empty, broken shell. He closed his eyes, listening to the rushing water. He had survived the crash. He had survived the impossible odds of the clearing, but the jungle had finally won. He prepared to let go, surrendering to the encroaching darkness. Then he heard it. It was a sharp, unnatural sound that cut through the ambient noise of the river. Click-clack. The distinct, metallic sound of a bolt-action rifle, chambering around. Henry's eyes snapped open. Standing 10 feet away, waist-deep in the ferns, was a man. He wasn't wearing the mustard-yellow uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army. He wore faded green dungarees, a soft utility cap, and he was aiming an M1000 903 Springfield rifle directly at Henry's chest. "Don't move a muscle, mate," a voice called out, thick with a heavy Australian accent. From the brush behind the rifleman, 2 more figures emerged. They were a mixed reconnaissance unit, Australian coast watchers running joint intelligence operations with elements of the 1st Marine Division ahead of the upcoming Cape Gloucester campaign. One of the men, a young, sharp-eyed American Marine scout who had point duty that day, stepped forward, his Thompson submachine gun leveled. The name stenciled lightly on his webbing read, Private First Class Robert Leckie, a man who would later become a highly decorated hero and one of the most famous chroniclers of the Pacific War. Leckie lowered his weapon slightly as he took in the horrific state of the man bleeding out in the mud. "Jesus Christ," Leckie muttered, stepping carefully down the bank. "He's an American. Look at the dog tags." Henry tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. The Australian patrol leader rushed forward, immediately digging into his pack for a medical kit. "Easy, Yank. We've got you. You're safe now." They carried Henry on a makeshift stretcher for 2 agonizing days, navigating the treacherous mountain passes until they reached a hidden coastwatcher camp carved into the cliffs. There, a field surgeon went to work, pumping Henry full of precious sulfanilamide and removing the rotting necrotic tissue from his shoulder. It was 3 days before Henry was lucid enough to be debriefed. He sat propped up on a canvas cot, a mug of hot condensed milk tea shaking in his right hand. Sitting across from him at a folding wooden table was an American intelligence officer, Major Higgins, who had hiked up to the camp specifically to interrogate the miracle survivor. "Captain Donovan," Higgins began, his pen poised over a notebook. "Your crew is confirmed, Kia. We found the wreckage of the Devil's Errand. But your survival? The timeline doesn't make sense. You were missing for nearly a week. What happened after the crash?" Henry took a slow sip of the tea. He looked around the dimly lit tent, listening to the rain hammer against the canvas. And then, in a flat, emotionless voice, he told them. He told them about the capture. He told them about the broken piece of aluminum. He told them about the katana, the crushed windpipe, the Type 99 machine gun, and the 7 minutes of absolute, unadulterated hell. When he finished, the tent was dead silent. Major Higgins had stopped writing halfway through the story. He stared at Henry, his expression a mix of profound skepticism and quiet horror. "Captain," Higgins said slowly, choosing his words with deliberate care, "you expect me to put in my official report that you, an unarmed, wounded aviator with his hands tied behind his back, single-handedly engaged and annihilated a reinforced Japanese infantry platoon of 54 men? "I don't expect anything, Major," Henry replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm just telling you why I'm not dead." Higgins closed his notebook. "It's a hell of a story, son. Hallucinations are common with severe trauma and jungle fever. We'll get you back to Port Moresby for proper psychiatric evaluation." They didn't believe him. It was simply too impossible. A statistical anomaly so massive it bordered on fiction. But Higgins, bound by protocol, ordered a heavily armed, squad-sized patrol, guided by the map Henry had stolen, to backtrack his route and verify the claim. Private Leckie volunteered for the detail, his innate curiosity as a writer piqued by the pilot's chilling, unwavering account. The patrol was gone for 4 days. When they returned to the coastwatcher camp, the men looked visibly shaken. They didn't speak as they walked past the perimeter guards. They headed straight for Major Higgins' tent. Leckie stepped inside, his uniform plastered with mud, his face pale beneath the grime. He didn't salute. He just dropped a heavy burlap sack onto the folding table. It landed with a loud metallic clatter. He wasn't hallucinating, Major, Lecky said quietly. Higgins opened the sack. Inside were 54 brass dog tags, stamped with Japanese kanji, caked in dried blood and mud. We found the clearing, Lecky continued, his voice tight. It was exactly like he said. Every detail. The massive tree. The spent 7.7 millimeters casings. The bodies. They were all there. But then Lecky paused, a strange, haunted look crossing his eyes. But there's something else, Major. The Japanese found the clearing before we did. The tracks were fresh. A recovery team. Maybe a whole company. And? Higgins pressed, leaning forward. Did they engage? No. Lecky shook his head. They didn't touch a single body. They didn't recover their dead or their weapons. They just stood at the edge of the clearing, and they built a shrine. Higgins frowned. A shrine? A wooden marker, driven into the mud, Lecky explained. Our translator read it. They didn't think it was an American soldier who did that, Major. They thought it was a yokai, a demon of the forest. They believed the jungle itself had risen up and slaughtered their men. They abandoned the entire sector out of sheer, superstitious terror. Major Higgins sat back in his chair, staring at the pile of bloody dog tags. The strategic implications were massive. A single American pilot had not only wiped out a platoon, but he had inadvertently shattered the morale of an entire Japanese sector, creating a ghost story so terrifying the enemy was actively avoiding the area. The next morning, Higgins visited Henry's cot. He carried a fresh file folder, stamped with red ink. Top secret. Captain Donovan, Higgins said, his tone entirely changed, respectful but firm. I have wired Pacific Command. You are being extracted immediately on a Catalina flying boat. You will be awarded the Navy Cross for your actions. Henry nodded slowly. Thank you, Major. However, Higgins continued, dropping the file onto Henry's lap. Your citation will state that you evaded capture and provided valuable intelligence regarding enemy troop movements. That is all. Henry looked up, confused. What about the clearing? The clearing never happened, Higgins stated coldly. The brass has classified the incident. First, because the American public wouldn't believe it, it sounds too much like cheap propaganda. Second, and more importantly, if the Imperial they will execute, and we cannot risk destroying the psychological warfare advantage we currently hold in that sector. As far as the Japanese are concerned, a demon haunts those woods. We are going to let them keep believing that. Henry looked down at his scarred, battered hands. He had fought a war for 7 impossible minutes, and his reward was absolute silence. He survived the war, returning to West Texas, a quiet, solitary man. He never spoke of New Britain. He never corrected the official military record. He carried the weight of those 420 seconds alone, locked away in the dark corners of his mind. Captain Henry Donovan lived a long life, but every time the sun set, casting long, grasping shadows across the plains, he remembered the deep green abyss, the hiss of the blade, and the terrible, mathematical truth of survival. Sometimes, the only way to beat the devil is to become him. Thank you so much for watching this unbelievable, classified story of World War II survival. History is full of hidden heroes and terrifying secrets that the history books tried to bury, but stories like Henry Donovan's deserve to be remembered. If this gripping tale of pure grit, survival, and the dark reality of war kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel uncover more classified history. Share this video with anyone who loves military history, intense storytelling, or incredible true survival stories. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly deep dives into the most intense, forgotten battles of the past. Leave a comment down below. What would you have done in those 7 minutes? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.